Okay, I think we can start. Welcome to this second lecture in the series on monetary revolutions. Tonight we are very fortunate to have a top expert on digital finance to talk to us about a proto-central bank, a Bank of Amsterdam. This is a private bank that later evolved into Central Bank of the Netherlands. And it has many interesting links to what central banks are doing today and are concerned about today. John is heading the Innovation and Digital Economy Unit at the Bank for International Settlement in Basel. He's incredibly productive. I just looked at the BIS website. This year alone, he has published 9 different papers internally, and I'm sure many of them will end up in top publications, like the one that he will discuss today that was published in Journal of Political Economy. John has also worked at the BIS office for the Americas in Mexico City. And before that, he was in the BIS as well, working at the Financial Stability Board. Prior to coming to the BIS, he had engagements in academia in the Netherlands, as well as in Dutch Central Bank and the private sector in Germany. So without further ado, John, please tell us what was so interesting about the Bank of Amsterdam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dubravko, and thanks everyone for taking part and being here tonight. I was very happy about the invitation to this. I understood that Dubravko has been involved now with the Croatian National Bank and with the museum, and I was going to note that I am a regular visitor of money museums around the world. My wife often gives me a hard time about that, for being a boring central banker who likes to learn about money even in my free time. So I've visited money museums in Canada, Finland, Mexico, Morocco, the Netherlands, but I've not yet been to Monetera. So I hope that in the future, on a visit to Croatia, I'll have the chance. And of course, I'm very glad to take part in this discussion. So as Dubravko mentioned, I'll be presenting today from a paper that is joint work with Wilco Bolt, Hyun-Song Shin, and Peter Wiertz. It's called The Bank of Amsterdam and the Limits of Fiat Money. And this is part of a broader research agenda looking at how money is changing in the digital age and about the institutions underpinning money, including central banks. So you'll see on the cover slide that money has changed a lot over the years. You have the transition from cowrie shells and Lydian coins through the first Chinese paper money, English tally sticks, stone coins of Yap, copper money and the like, all the way up through modern ATMs, card readers, and the new interfaces on smartphones. The Bank of Amsterdam played a very important role in this transition of money through the years. You'll see a paper ledger toward the middle of the cover slide, and that is actually a specific record from the ledgers used like those at the bank. And what we discuss in the paper is that the bank was also a predecessor of many of today's institutions like central banks, as well as, if you will, today's stablecoins. So there are deeper lessons for the limits of fiat money, and I'll discuss what I mean in just a moment. So here's the roadmap of what I'll be talking about today. I'll start by describing our interest in the Bank of Amsterdam and why we see it as an early stablecoin. I'll talk about what I mean by that. I'll then talk about how the bank evolved over time, moving from a rigid to a more elastic structure and fulfilling many of the functions that a modern central bank fulfills, including providing settlement liquidity and serving as a lender of last resort. Then, importantly, I'll talk about the bank's downfall in the late 18th and early 19th century, and what it tells us for the limits of fiat money and the constraints that central banks may face in the 21st century. So I'll conclude with a few lessons for the digital age.
John, could you please try to speak up because back of the room cannot hear you. I'm sorry, but we don't have very good...
I'll aim to speak a little bit louder, and if there's any problems in being audible, then just let me know, and I will speak louder. No problem. Okay, so let's start with the bank itself. The Bank of Amsterdam was founded in 1609, and it was a precursor of modern central banks. It's often considered the first public Giro bank that became, a central bank later on. And you can see here from the Dutch Golden Age, this is a painting of the headquarters of the Bank of Amsterdam on the main square, Dam Square in Amsterdam. Today, this building is still there. It is the Royal Palace in Amsterdam. But up until the Napoleonic period, this was the City Hall. And the Bank of Amsterdam was actually headquartered in City Hall, and it was there as a public institution. So it was founded by the city authorities with private shareholders, as Dubravko mentioned, with an explicit mandate to check the confusion of coin, as it was called. So the idea was that there were a lot of circulating trade coins in those days, different metal coins, primarily silver, some golden coins, that were used in international commerce. They often were of differing quality. They circulated different exchange rates. And the bank was instituted to try to bring some uniformity and to reduce some of that confusion in the monetary system. It was modeled on similar institutions in Venice, Rome, Genoa, and Naples. And interestingly, the bank itself was also an inspiration to Stockholmsbanken, which was the predecessor of the Swedish Riksbank, founded in 1664, and to the Bank of England, founded in 1694. Of course, the Bank of England was founded by William of Orange, who himself came from the Netherlands and was intimately familiar with the Bank of Amsterdam. And so I think that's an important link between the Dutch Republic and then, of course, a very well-known prominent central bank that many of us have interacted with today. If you look at its early balance sheet, it had a very simple structure. So on the asset side, it held primarily metal coins, so silver coins from the New World, particularly Spanish silver coins, and to a lesser extent, gold. And customers could physically deposit their coins with the bank and receive an assurance of their quality. On the liability side, it had accounts by merchants, up to 3,000 merchants at its peak. And in its first 7 decades, it's what we might call a rigid stablecoin. Its balances were determined passively by the flow of deposits in and out. Whenever someone would bring coins to the bank, they would then be credited with a balance in bank guilders on the liability side of the balance sheet. And if they wanted to redeem their coins, they could do that, and then the balance sheet would shrink accordingly. Still, the bank served a very important function, just without much discretion over its balance sheet. It had this rigid structure, and the size of the balances was determined primarily by client demand. It did enjoy an impeccable reputation. For instance, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith devotes several pages to the bank. And the whole passage is great, but I'll just quote one part of it. He says, "At Amsterdam, however, no point of faith is better established than that for every guilder circulated as bank money, there is a correspondent guilder in gold or silver to be found in the treasure of the bank." He went on to say the governing burgomasters ensure that it is so, and in this sober and religious country, oaths are not taken in vain. So in other words, people keep their promises. They can be certain that one guilder held at the bank corresponds to a guilder in coins kept in reserve. And there are some other great stories I won't go into them, but Voltaire also has a very memorable description of the bank and of the panic of 1672, when the bank was able to maintain this reputation. So it was really known for being well run, for having a one-to-one backing at all times. But perhaps somewhat ironically, just around the time that Adam Smith was writing that was when the bank actually started to diverge from that one-to-one backing, for reasons that I'll talk about in just a moment. Now, because of this high reputation and the function that the bank fulfilled in running a payment system, the bank guilders actually traded at a premium to the coins. So if you had one bank guilder in your account at the Bank of Amsterdam, then on average that was worth about 5% more than having a coin, a metal guilder, in your pocket. And this premium can be tracked over time. There's very good data going back to the late 17th century about the Dutch agio, it's called. And for the most part, this fluctuated around 5%. So it was pretty stable. And you can see this as a gauge of trust in the bank. And so you can see up in Adam Smith's time, that's shown here around 1776, it was remarkably stable. So this gauge of trust was a useful measure for looking at trust overall. And you can see that it actually even picked up a little bit during the crisis of 1762, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. But then there comes a period where the agio starts to erode, and where, as I'll talk about later, it finally breaks into negative territory where people lost their trust in the bank. And then it took quite a while to recover from that. And that was what really led to the bank's downfall and its eventual replacement with today's modern central bank. So what happened? Why is it that this very simple, rigid structure gave way to a very different structure and eventually a breakdown entirely of the functioning of the bank? So to understand that, we have to go to the next chapter in the story. And the question is, was full backing really optimal, and was that really the solution? The reality was a little bit more complex than what we were discussing before. And as we would argue, full backing alone would not have been sufficient for the bank to play the important global role that it ultimately did. So really this change happened in the late 17th century already. From 1683 onward, the bank moved toward this more elastic structure. There was a new system, the receipts system, and explicit money creation. So the way that this happened, starting in 1683, the bank introduced a new innovation. It suspended convertibility, creating a gap between so-called current guilders, the coins that circulated in daily use, and bank guilders, the accounts at the bank. As before, the public could still deposit their metal coins with the bank through the receipt system. They would receive a receipt and could redeem the coins after a period of 6 months. So the coins that were held with receipts were encumbered, and the deposits that matched with those coins were called encumbered deposits. But on top of that, the bank could also buy and sell coins freely in the market. You can see that as an early form of open market operations. And these coins, as well as the deposits that were created through purchases, were under the discretion of the bank. They were unencumbered. They weren't promised to any specific holder of bank guilders. So one could argue, as researchers like Stephen Quinn and Will Roberts have, that this policy change was the genesis of modern fiat money. The bank, after this change, started to fulfill the functions of a proto-central bank. It did so in 3 main ways. First, it tried to keep the agio stable, around 5% on average, through monetary operations, buying and selling coins whenever the agio started to diverge from this target. Second, it adjusted the money stock for settlement liquidity in the wholesale payment system. So especially for these transactions between those 3,000 merchants and the Dutch East India Company and other major businesses that I'll talk about. Finally, it functioned as a lender of last resort in times of stress. So let me just show some evidence for what I'm talking about. First, regarding the maintenance of a stable agio, the bank would frequently purchase precious metal whenever there was a shock in the agio. So if the agio went up and the difference between bank guilders and current guilders was getting too large, then the bank could buy metal coins, then pushing down the difference between the two. And that's a little bit like modern central banks do to maintain a policy target. They have operations like this. And you can actually see this. We do some calculations, impulse response function, similar to what Quinn and Roberts do for the period 1736 to 1775. We really see in practice these purchases in response to positive shocks of the agio. And it was symmetric. So when the agio fell, they would then sell coins, reduce the size of the balance sheet, make bank guilders more scarce relative to current guilders, and that in turn would push up the agio. So they did this actively and with discretion in order to maintain a stable agio. Second, I'm going to talk about the role in settlement liquidity, but I'm going to need to explain a little bit more about the structure of the financial sector at the time to do so. So, as I'll talk about more, one of the largest entities in the local economy at the time was the Dutch East India Company, which was known by its Dutch acronym VOC. And there are wonderful paintings, if you look at the city archives or the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Here's one painting of a ship of the VOC, and they were active around the world trading in colonies and financed through stock, as a joint stock company. So the VOC traded in outposts across Asia, particularly in Galle in today's Sri Lanka, and in Batavia, today's Jakarta in Indonesia. And you can see that there are these various trade networks, so sea routes that connect the different trading ports of the day with Cape Town and Amsterdam. And they traded spices, sugar, cloth, as well as those coins, silver coins that I talked about. And it tended to be that they would depart and return in a seasonal pattern. So we actually have the digitized ship logs from the Dutch East India Company. And you can see that the departures from Europe tended to happen toward the end of the year. So around November, December, January, most frequently. In some occasions, also August, September, October. They would then go out, trade in the colonies, and return usually around May and June, sometimes July. That's shown in the red bars here. Between their departure and their arrival, there was a lack of money in the payment system. So that could result in gridlock, much like the differences in intraday credit that we know of today. There would be outgoing payments, but there wouldn't yet be the incoming payments in order to provide sufficient liquidity. So the bank played a very important role in smoothing this, providing settlement liquidity in the system. And they did that through loans. So you can see this in the unencumbered accounts. It created these on its balance sheet in order to grant credit to the VOC as the largest commercial client of the day. And there was a very clear correlation between the change in Dutch East India loan companies, shown on the x-axis, and the changes in unencumbered accounts in millions of guilders, shown on the y-axis. So essentially, they were diverging from this one-to-one backing. Instead of having one metal coin to back each bank guilder in deposits, there were some occasions where they could lend to the VOC for a period of a few months. They would be paid back again, and that would help to keep the payment system functioning smoothly in the interim. And strictly speaking, that wasn't allowed under their mandate, but in practice, it did allow them to play this very important role, and it probably helped Amsterdam to maintain its position as a global financial center. Finally, I'm going to talk about the role the Bank of Amsterdam played as a lender of last resort, that third function. And this was particularly clear in the panic of 1762 and 3. So in this year, and this has been written about at length by Hyun Song Shin and Isabel Schnabel, for instance, there was a panic that affected the market for bills of trade. And I won't go into the details, but there were bills of trade that linked together the trading posts of Amsterdam, as well as Prussia at the time, the emerging market. There was a sudden drying up of credit across this very long chain. And so the bank was needed to step in and to credit the accounts of various borrowers. So it accepted a very large inflow of deposits. It changed its collateral framework to actually allow for collateralized lending to creditworthy borrowers. They started accepting different types of collateral, additional coins that it hadn't accepted before. And this helped to smooth the panic and the shocks to the payment system. And it cemented the role of Amsterdam as an important financial center after 1763. And if you would like, I mean, you can draw a very clear parallel with the role that central banks played more recently, for instance, in the global financial crisis, or even in the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The Fed, in this case, also accepted more deposits, accepted different types of collateral, and that helps to smooth the shocks to the payment system during 2020. So if we take a very long view, this is the asset side of the Bank of Amsterdam balance sheets over its full lifespan from 1609 all the way up till 1820. You can see that over the majority of this period, this worked very well. Despite the proto-central bank operations, the role in maintaining the agio and settlement liquidity and functioning as a lender of last resort, for the most part, bank guilders remained backed by metal stock that was shown here in red. There was some divergence, for instance, in the 1730s and 1740s, but this didn't really threaten the bank's solidity. It's only at the end of the 18th century, and in particular after 1780, that we see this striking divergence from full backing and ultimately the bank's downfall. So what happened? I'll now discuss that in a little bit more depth. So the VOC, as I mentioned, was an extremely important player in the economy of the Netherlands and of Amsterdam, as well as the functioning of the bank and the financial system in Amsterdam. And the immediate trigger for the bank's downfall was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War of 1780 to 1784. As you can tell, there had been other wars with England previously, but in this particular war, the English and Dutch fought in European, Asian, and African waters. The Dutch lost quite a few ships in battle, including ships of the VOC. This was around the same time, by the way, as the American Revolution. There was a large global conflagration between the UK, France, the Netherlands, Spain, so a number of different theaters of war. But what was important for the purposes of the discussion today is that quite a few ships were lost. Ships were sunk given these seaborne battles. This is visible in trade statistics. So you can see here that in 1780, trade dropped by nearly 3/4. Ships that had been kitted out for the voyage to Asia didn't return. And again, you can see this in the digitized ships logs. There's lots of very specific cases of ships that didn't make the journey back to Amsterdam. So the bank had initially lent to the VOC on a short-term basis, primarily for settlement liquidity, but now it had to do so on a much larger scale, really to bail out the VOC, which was an important employer, an important economic entity in that time. And trust in the bank, as measured by the Agio, started to suffer. So you can see here that in 1780, there was already a few shocks. The bank was able to largely hide what they were doing, and it didn't come to light. In 1782, it became more clear. The bank steadily ramped up its lending, but it was still able to maintain trust. And it's only in 1790 that the Agio turns negative for the first time. It was finally in 1795, actually, when the French Revolutionary Army, the forces of Napoleon, entered the Netherlands, that the new authorities instructed that the full books be made public, and then it became clear that the bank was really in over its neck with credit to the BOC. Trust evaporated, the Agio went sharply negative, and the bank lived on, but in a very diminished form up until the early 19th century. In 1814, the new king who came in to replace Napoleon's little brother founded the modern central bank, the Nederlandse Bank, and then eventually closed the Bank of Amsterdam. And that's why the Netherlands, despite, of course, the long history with the Bank of Amsterdam and a long history of central banking, now has a central bank that was only founded in 1814 rather than the 1609. So there are a lot of lessons from this episode for debates today. And so I'd like to just briefly touch on two of these now. First of all, in our paper, we draw this lesson that there is a unique breakpoint where the negative equity of a central bank and asset illiquidity can erode trust in fiat money. I haven't shown our formal model today, but suffice it to say that you can solve for this breakpoint. And so even though modern central banks may lend to governments, for instance, may have collateral frameworks for lending as lender of last resort to financial institutions, generally that goes well. Generally, we aren't too worried about the equity position of central banks. Central banks can operate with negative equity at times. But there is a point at which you can go too far. There is a break point. And if that happens, then trust in money can break down. And of course, it's very important to stay away from that break point so as not to risk that trust in money erodes as well. And second, for a central bank to play its important role in the economy, the fiscal backing of the sovereign and its fiscal sustainability are essential. The bank at the time didn't have full fiscal backing from the city authorities. And that meant when it did make losses, it wasn't able to recover. Ultimately, the bank had to give way to this new institution, the Nederlandse Bank, and thus to a central bank that's operated more successfully for the 2 centuries since. But now, of course, in the euro area, there are explicit requirements that if a central bank has negative equity, it must be recapitalized by the government. And this explains why this might be so important. But if you take away one thing from this historical discussion, I think that should be the following. There is a reason that we have national central banks and sovereign fiat currencies in nearly every country in the world today. We've tried through trial and error, including episodes like this one, with different institutions, but we found that this institutional innovation of central banks has proven remarkably robust. And today, in the digital era, there are opportunities to improve the payment system and the functions of money, but there shouldn't be a role for changing the governance that underpins money. Having solid central banks with sound finances remains as important as ever. And the photo I'm showing, by the way, I love this picture. I took it myself. This is from the City Hall, now the Royal Palace in Amsterdam. This shows the fall of Icarus, who of course had wax wings and was flying too close to the sun. And above it, you can see empty treasure chests, rats, worthless pieces of paper, and these are all symbols for bankruptcy. This is actually the room where in the past the bankruptcy court was held. So it's, I think, a wonderful image, a wonderful visual metaphor for the downfall of the bank and for the dangers of losing trust in money in this case. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I would then like to pass over to Dubravko, who, and I'll be happy to take questions, but I think Dubravko will be presenting just after. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, John. This was excellent. I found it really interesting. I believe others in the audience as well. Could we have some questions now to continue the conversation. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation, and I really like the story on Bank of Amsterdam. I am sure that you are familiar with Ulrich Binsel's book, The Central Banking Before 1800, Great Rehabilitation. So I see many similarities between the Bank of Amsterdam and the predecessors of the central bank that Mr. Binsel mentions in his book, like Taula de Camba from Barcelona, and the banks from Genoa and Venice and the city of Hamburg and so on. So I see that there are some differences between, but broadly speaking, I would put Bank of Amsterdam in a... do we hear you? We don't see you, sorry. Sorry, now I see you.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
I think that I got most of the question, but I lost maybe the last 10 seconds.
Simply the differences between Bank of Amsterdam and the big difference is that Bank of Amsterdam was a municipal bank actually, and the banks from Genoa and Barcelona were not, in that respect, they were not public banks. But otherwise, there are many similarities between them.
Right. Yes. No. Absolutely. I think that there were important similarities. Ulrich Binsel's book is a very useful reference on this. We cite that when we talk about the inspiration for the Bank of Amsterdam. Especially Italian public giro banks had come previously, and so they were the explicit model for the Bank of Amsterdam. And agreed, there were a number of parallels there. I think what's unique about the Bank of Amsterdam is that it really operated in an international context. So Amsterdam at the time was an international financial center. There were merchants from other countries from around Europe and from around the world that did business through Amsterdam. And it was notable that when the bank was originally founded, the Netherlands was still part of the Spanish Empire. It was under Habsburg rule during the 80 Years' War. So the Dutch and Spanish were fighting, and the Dutch Republic was fighting for independence. And it was during that period that the bank was founded, that the flourishing of trade happened. Despite the open conflict, there was still a lot of trade happening through Amsterdam with other countries. And the bank was really set up to try to intermediate between this chaos that existed of different currencies, different types of trade coins that were being used. And so it has been argued that the bank guilder was the first global reserve currency. It was really used in trade, in setting financial contracts for cross-border transactions. And it was only in the late 18th century that role was, went over to the British pound, and the center of global commerce shifted from Amsterdam to London. And then, of course, in the 1930s, it shifted to the US dollar, and maybe the third global reserve currency that we have today. But I think that's what is unique about the Bank of Amsterdam, that it really ended up having this important international role. And I think that a reason that it was able to play that role was because it did diverge from full backing and did have these kind of early operations of a modern central bank. We also in the paper cite Bagehot, who of course in Lombard Street was talking about the Bank of England, but he was making the point that in order to maintain this system, this financial system and edifice of credit, you need to have the ability to lend against good collateral in times of stress, to have a lender of last resort. The system only works if there is a central institution willing to jump in and play that role. And so the Bank of England has done that, successfully over a few centuries now. And prior to the Bank of England, the Bank of Amsterdam was doing that for the bank guilder as an international currency.
Are there other questions? Yes, Marco.
Thank you as well for the interesting presentation. I have to make a caveat. I'm not quite familiar with what was going on with Bank of Amsterdam, but what struck my interest or curiosity is that initially you mentioned there was a very strict rules on the balance sheet. And you called it kind of a stable coin. What reminded me of is the currency board in modern economy. And typically currency board have very strict limits or cannot do the lend of last resort to a very limited extent or liquidity in the market. So my question is, if the Bank of Amsterdam cannot create more money than deposits are to have a fixed balance sheet, where did the money come if there were liquidity needs higher than were the, let's say, excess reserves of the bank? I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but my understanding is they couldn't create money ex nihilo like modern central banks, and that, in my view, would be a serious constraint, like I said, currency board in today's world. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the parallels with modern currency boards have also been drawn, and there is a literature about the Bank of Amsterdam, and our paper is just one of a number in this literature that draw parallels with modern days. So you could, draw lessons for the, downfall of the Argentine currency board in 2001 and 2002, for instance, or with other currency boards that have existed in the past. And I think that what we also discussed a little bit in the paper is there's an asymmetry. The bank was able to create money when needed. It could really purchase coins in the market, it could do open market operations and create balances, deposits that were held by merchants. So, it could essentially purchase coins by creating bank money that the recipients would hold. And that was a means of generating additional liquidity and lengthening the balance sheet. But there were limits of how far it could go in the other direction. It couldn't sell any more coins than it had access to. Just the way that a country that has a currency board can't sell any more than its official reserves. And so that was an issue at some point. There were a few periods in the 1780s where the bank actually depleted its stock of metal coins, and then eventually had to repurchase them and to try to regain trust. Yeah, and I think that there is a problem there, that you can use this discretion to a certain extent. You can expand and contract the money supply, but there are limits. And if you run out of reserves, and in this case metal coins, then at some point there's not much that you can do. You're very constrained. And so I think that there are some parallels with modern days. There are other countries that try introducing capital controls and other means of maintaining pegs. But at some point, then if trust breaks down, then there's not much that can be done to maintain it.
More questions? I have one question. What was the motivation for introducing this category of encumbered deposits? And follow up, can you tell us a bit more about the profitability of the Bank of Amsterdam?
Okay, so I understood the motivation for the difference between encumbered and unencumbered deposits.
Yes.
And then insights about the profitability of the bank, is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Very good. Okay, so the distinction between encumbered and unencumbered deposits came in 1683. And I think as a backdrop to that, it's important to know that there was this crisis of 1672 that I briefly talked about. And actually, I have a couple slides on this if you'd like. I can maybe share my screen once more. Here we go. This is just a really nice story. I wanted to have the chance to share it if I can. There was an operational incident at one stage in 1652 at the bank. There was actually a fire. So the town hall at the time, as shown on the left, this is what it used to look like before the Royal Palace was built. It burnt down. That's shown here in the painting on the right. And so luckily, the bank managed to survive this incident. They actually took bags of coins and threw them out the window, and they were able to collect almost everything again, and then move locations and set up again. And so Voltaire wrote about this nearly a century later. He talked about the crisis of 1672, 20 years after this fire, and he described those private persons who were possessed of banknotes ran in crowds to the Bank of Amsterdam. The magistrates immediately ordered the vaults to be opened where the treasure is kept. When it was found entire, as it had been deposited there for upwards of 60 years, the money was still black and discolored, with the fire that had burnt down the townhouse several years before, 1652. So the fact that there was actually burn marks on the coins showed that they really had been left there in the 20 years since. And that's why I refer to a Dutch George Bailey. If you guys know the classic movie, It's a Wonderful Life, there's the scene where George Bailey, the owner of a small bank, averts a bank run by showing people that the money is safe, the money is still there. So this is an example of that. And so the crisis of 1762 was eventually averted. So even though there were important geopolitical things going on at the time, there was defeat of the Dutch Republic in this war against Spain, France, and England at the same time. The bank managed to survive that. And after that, I think that the bank started taking on more of an important role as a lender of last resort, as an institution supporting the payment system. So even though the Netherlands lost a number of their colonies, including New York and previously New Amsterdam in 1672, and they had a weakened international position, the bank ended up with a much stronger position. And I think that 10 years later, that's what led to this change between encumbered and unencumbered coins. It was kind of an innovation that started simple, allowing for the bank to use the discretion of its balance sheet in addition to the receipts system. And then over time, that allowed it to become, to develop and become a more important proto-central bank. Regarding its profitability, the bank was able to earn fees from its activities. And so it did generate profits, but those profits were almost universally paid out to the town treasury every year. So it didn't actually keep a capital buffer. It pretty much always paid out the entire receipts to the town authorities. And so in practice, that meant that there wasn't really an equity cushion there when it was needed.
Okay, thank you. Are there more questions? Please.
Hello. I would just like to ask, what was the ratio of encumbered and unencumbered assets through history, through this period?
So the ratio between encumbered and unencumbered fluctuated quite a bit over time. I actually have another slide there that I can share if it's useful. This just shows the period between 1775 and 1792. I'm going to see if I... okay, wait, one more time. Entire screen. Okay. So for a lot of the period, it was kind of like, what you see here for the period 1775 to 1780, that encumbered metals, encumbered coins on the asset side of the balance sheet were the majority, and correspondingly encumbered deposits on the liability side of the balance sheet were the majority of deposits. But at some point, you see unencumbered metals playing a bigger role. And then importantly, when this kind of large scale lending to the VOC started, then loans become the dominant asset on the asset side of the liability, on the asset side of the balance sheet. And then you had a lot more unencumbered balances on the other side. So during most of the lifespan of the bank, it was kind of a majority that was encumbered, but then as things shifted, then you got a larger unencumbered share.
Someone more? So I have one last question if there are no more from the public. It seems that in the end it was really exposure to a single large customer that brought down the bank. Could one then, did you think of a narrative around that story, that it was really a concentration risk on in the loan portfolio rather than other issues that brought down the Bank of Amsterdam?
Yeah, of course. So now in the Basel Committee rules, we have a large exposure regime. So individual banks shouldn't have exposure like this to one individual counterparty. And I think that, it was a really extreme example that I showed there. But I think it's important to note that the VOC was also not any normal customer. It wasn't a normal corporate client. I mean, the VOC at the time, played a role in many different things. I should acknowledge very openly that the VOC also has a pretty ruthless side, and if you look at some of what they did in Indonesia and the wholesale murder of the population of civilians in a lot of places. I mean, they functioned though essentially as an arm of the Dutch state, if you will. I mean, they really colonized entire countries. So the VOC, even though it's sometimes seen as the first joint stock company and as a kind of typical privately owned company, by other means it was almost like a state entity. And I think that if we wanted to look at today's context, I think it's very rare for central banks to lend to individual borrowers. I mean, I think that most central banks don't have any corporate lending, or if they have kind of funding for lending programs for individual banks, then it's against collateral, and it's usually in fairly strict limits. But of course, what central banks do have quite a bit of is lending to their own government, and there are quite a few governments in the world today that do not look particularly solvent. I'm from the United States. I'll note that my own country's government does not look particularly solvent these days, and so the large-scale lending, in the form of holding government debt, could also be a problem. But of course, if the government, especially if the U.S. government defaults, were in maybe much bigger trouble than just the immediate effect on central bank finances. Nonetheless, I think that's the parallel that we should be thinking about today in the context of fiscal sustainability and backing for fiat money.
Okay, John, thanks very much. This was really stimulating, thought-provoking, and I'm sure people here will now start clicking on many of these names and to find out more. So thanks again so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and we'll stay in touch.
Absolutely.
All the best.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. U redu, onda možemo preći na hrvatski, ako se svi slažu. Slajdovi će biti na engleskom, ispričavam se zbog terminologije. Hvala. Da li me dobro čujete ili je preglasno, recite samo, teško mi je znati. Dakle, ovo je drugo izlaganje u ovoj seriji. Danas sam predvidio još kratko preći kroz prvo izlaganje koje smo imali pred mjesec dana u interesu onih koji ovdje nisu bili. I na kraju bih se nadovezao povijesno tamo gdje je John negdje stao, rano 19. stoljeće i razvoj središnjih banaka kroz 19. stoljeće sve do početka Prvog svjetskog rata. To je razdoblje klasičnog zlatnog standarda. Dakle, pred mjesec dana Bob McCauley, koji je prije radio u BIS-u, a sada surađuje sa Boston University i Oxford University, govorio je o međunarodnoj ulozi dolara. Pitanje koje je postavio je da li će uloga dolara polako izblijediti ili će ostati dominantna kao što je danas. I glavni odgovor koji je on dao, ostaće i dalje dominantna. Ako će bljediti, to će biti jako postepen proces. I prošao je put od tamo negdje 50. 60. godina kada je dolar stvarno bio dominantan, ali kada se već počela nazirati kroz razne angažmane američke u inozemstvu, da se ta vrijednost dolara ipak može potresti s vremena na vrijeme. Jedan od glavnih upitnika u ulogu dolara je bio rat u Vijetnamu, zbog kojeg je došlo do velike dolarske likvidnosti u svijetu, inflacije u Americi. Zatim je to bila naftna kriza, 73. godine nastajanje euro-dolarskog tržišta. Međutim, kroz sve to dolar se je dosta dobro održao. Bob nam je ispričao kako je puno od te dominantne uloge dolara u svijetu bilo u stvari nenamjerna politika američkih vlasti. Oni nisu aktivno gurali ulogu dolara u međunarodnom monetarnom sistemu kao što danas to pokušava činiti recimo Kina. Međutim, isto tako u kritičnim trenucima je uloga dolara bila podržavana sa strane središnje banke. 60. i 70. godina bile su krize likvidnosti na eurodolarskom tržištu. 70. godina povezane sa velikim deficitom u Velikoj Britaniji. Kada i u ta kritična vremena je Fed plasirao dodatnu likvidnost na to eurodolarsko tržište kako bi ono moglo nastaviti funkcionirati. U velikom stilu se ta uloga vratila 2008. godine nakon velike financijske krize i opet na početku pandemije kada je Fed imao inovaciju tih swap lines. Dakle, on je omogućio neograničen pristup velikim središnjim bankama iz cijelog svijeta, pristup dolarskoj likvidnosti. Središnje banke u Europi, Velikoj Britaniji, Japanu onda su dalje koristile tu dolarsku likvidnost da bi davale kratkoročne kredite svojim financijskim institucijama i na taj način je spriječen još veći kolaps financijskog sistema, a istovremeno je to koristilo i američkim kućanstvima i privredi jer kamatne stope nisu skočile onoliko koliko bi skočile da je došlo do stvarne nestašice dolara. Dakle, Fed je u stvari bio taj lender of last resort za svjetski financijski sustav po pitanju dolarske likvidnosti. Te swap lines su aktivne još uvijek i Bob je govorio o tome kakva je struktura upravljanja tim swap lines unutar Feda. Ona je vrlo čvrsta i administracija nema toliko utjecaja koliko se obično misli da bi mogla potezom pera ukinuti te swap lines. Dakle, one još uvijek postoje i mogu u slučaju krize opet se aktivirati. Međutim, u slučaju da Fed iz bilo kojih razloga, što nije toliko izgledno, ne želi više aktivirati u budućoj krizi te linije dolarskog kreditiranja, Postavlja se pitanje što bi druge središnje banke mogle napraviti i Bob je tu predložio da one stvore jednu koaliciju voljnih središnjih banaka. One zajedno mogu prikupiti prilično veliki iznos tih dolarskih rezervi i također je razradio na koje načine kroz taj svjetski financijski sustav mogu koristiti te rezerve za podršku bankama izvan Amerike. Treba će im u tom nastojanju uvijek podrška američkog financijskog sistema. Međutim, sve se to može organizirati ako se o tome počne pravovremeno razmišljati. Dakle, sve u svemu jedna pozitivna rasprava. Možemo biti relativno mirni o tome da će Fed i u doglednoj budućnosti podržavati taj svjetski financijski sistem kroz tu ulogu lender of last resort, koja je ključna, kao što smo vidjeli iz ovog prethodnog izlaganja. Dakle, to je toliko o zadnjem izlaganju. Ja bih sada samo ukratko, zbog nekog povijesnog kontinuiteta i interesa ove serije, govorio o tom klasičnom zlatnom standardu. Ono što je naglasio John u svom izlaganju je ta ravnoteža između javne i privatne uloge novca. Dakle, uvijek je novac bio negdje na razmeđi između javnog i privatnog. Javni element je taj koji garantira kolektivne neke interese, to je neka društvena norma, a privatni sektor onda uvijek je taj koji je snabdjevač tehnologije, plaćanja tehnologije, kreditiranja, tehnologije zaduživanja. I to je bilo uvijek kroz povijest tako. Recimo tamo davno u Mezopotamiji javni sektor su bili svećenici koji su držali u hramovima zlatnike i žito koje se onda koristilo kao novac. A privatni sektor je onda izmislio one glinene ploče na kojima su se zapisivali krediti, dugovanja i prenosila su se među trgovcima. Danas isto tako imamo jednu javnu dimenziju novca, to je taj fiat novac. Imamo privatnu dimenziju koja je dominantna, privatne banke, depozitni novac. Međutim, pojavile su se i te digitalne valute koje su još uvijek na nekoj razmeđi između privatnog i javnoga i ta ravnoteža se sad u ovim trenucima definira, između ostalog i u Americi, u Europi. Europska centralna banka ovih dana upravo raspravlja o tome kako regulirati stable coins. Amerika već ima taj Genius Act koji donekle za sada regulira korištenje stable coinsa, ali i taj će se zakon vjerojatno morati mijenjati sa razvojem. Dakle, privatno, javno, važno da to uvijek imamo u vidu. Početkom 19. stoljeća većina zemalja je bila još na tom srebrnom standardu. Kroz povijest su srebrne kovanice bile najuspješniji novac, jer održale su se već par tisućljeća. Francuska i par drugih zemalja je bilo na bimetalnom standardu gdje se vrijednost srebra i zlata tokom stoljeća održavala na ovoj razini otprilike 15,5:1. Imate jednu jako zanimljivu povijesnu anegdotu gdje je Isaac Newton krivo izmjerio odnos srebra i zlata, međutim to što je on izmjerio je ostalo kao 15,5:1. On je naime bio zadužen u kraljevskoj kovanici da provjerava kvalitetu zlata, srebra, zlatnika i srebrnog novca. To malo podsjeća isto na Einsteina. On je također radio na početku kao činovnik u patentnom uredu u Bernu. Isaac Newton je morao zarađivati za svoja istraživanja isto tako u javnom sektoru, recimo. Prva zemlja koja je bila, prva značajna ekonomija koja je bila na zlatnom standardu je bila Velika Britanija. Ono što je svi znamo za zlatni standard da su novčane jedinice definirane količinom zlata. Za 1 funtu je to bilo 7,3 grama finog zlata. Međutim, ono što je značajnije još je bio jedan zakon donesen 1944. godine kada je parlament ograničio mogućnost Bank of England da izdaje novčanice. Dakle, on je na neki način onemogućio ono što je Bank of Amsterdam napravio kada je uveo te encumbered deposits i to je onda puno značilo za povjerenje u novac, u novčanice koje je izdavala Bank of England. Jedno 10-ak ubrzo nakon toga je u Kaliforniji, Australiji pronađene su velike količine zlata. To je značajno povećalo ponudu zlata u svjetskoj ekonomiji i na neki način je to prisililo Francusku da napusti taj bimetalni, dvometalni sustav, pređe na zlatni i američka privreda koja je onda još bila neka emerging economy također je prihvatila zlatni standard. Ono što se u povijesti obično označava kao ključno za svjetsku ulogu zlatnog standarda je prihvaćanje tog standarda sa strane Njemačke 1973. godine nakon rata između Francuske i Prusije. Prema mirovnom sporazumu Francuska je morala platiti u ono vrijeme ogromnu jednu količinu zlata kao reparacije. To je bilo skoro 1,5 metričkih tona. Za usporedbu danas je godišnja proizvodnja zlata oko 5.000 metričkih tona. A to je bilo pred skoro 200 godina više. I to je onda ponukalo Njemačku da prihvati, da unificira svoj monetarni sustav na osnovi zlata, a uskoro iza toga su i druge zemlje prihvatile zlatni sistem. Austro-Ugarska, na primjer, tek 1892. godine. Vrlo zanimljiv zaključak, slažem se. Da. Kao što je John rekao, većina evropskih zemalja već su imale središnje banke u to vrijeme. One su se razvile iz tih komercijalnih banaka. Bank of Amsterdam, Njemačka je imala Bank of Hamburg, odnosno Prusija, i one su bile konstituirane obično kao privatne firme ili u ovom slučaju Bank of Amsterdam vlasništvo je bila gradska uprava amsterdamska. Val veliki osnivanja središnjih banaka je uslijedio nakon Napoleonskih ratova početkom 20. godina 19. stoljeća. Tada se, na primjer, Austrijska središnja banka osnovala 1816. godine. Do tada, vidite, ulogu središnje banke je igrala ta Wiener Stadtbanko. Ovo je jedna novčanica koju je izdavala od 20 guldena. Vrlo slična operacija kao i Bank of Amsterdam. A nakon što je osnovana ta Austrijska središnja banka, koja se onda zvala Privilegierte Österreichische Nationalbank, ona je izdavala dionice koje su privatne osobe mogle kupiti. Ovo je zanimljivo zato jer je to dionica koju je posjedovao Ludwig van Beethoven. Vidite tu u drugom redu napisano, kupljena 1819. godine. Beethoven je volio, izgleda, investirati dosta, ali bio je risk averse, nije želio investirati u neke... Da. Kako je taj klasični zlatni standard operirao? Zanimljive su paralele s onim što je John pričao. Obično se misli da je to bio vrlo rigidan sustav gdje je razina cijena ovisila o količini zlata u nekoj ekonomiji. Međutim, od samog početka je bilo dosta fleksibilnosti u tome kako je taj sistem funkcionirao. U principu jedina središnja banka koja se držala tih pravila igre je bila Bank of England. I, na primjer, kada bi Velika Britanija imala deficit u bilanci i kada bi u principu zlato trebalo odlaziti iz Velike Britanije u druge zemlje da se taj deficit plati, zlato je ostajalo u Velikoj Britaniji. Ono što bi se desilo je da je Bank of England povećao kamatne stope i to bi onda dovelo, kao što i danas dovodi, do određene recesije, do pada cijena. Povećala bi se time konkurentnost britanske privrede i postepeno bi počeo kapital dolaziti u Veliku Britaniju. Dakle, nije bilo toliko kretanja zlata kao što se obično misli, nego se je, kao i danas, većina tih neravnoteža rješavala putem operacija na financijskim tržištima. Većina zemalja nije čak ni to radila, kao Velika Britanija. Oni ne bi, na primjer, kad bi imali deficit u bilanci plaćanja, dovoljno povećali kamate, nego bi pokušavali samo malo pokazati volju da zaoštre monetarne uvjete. Isto tako su, kad bi stvarno bile u krizi, zemlje znale privremeno napustiti taj zlatni standard, pa bi se onda vratile na njega kad bi se situacija poboljšala. Mnoge središnje banke su isto tako sterilizirale pritoke zlata, ne bi dozvolile inflaciju kad bi, recimo, zlato novo otkriveno iz Južne Afrike došlo u zemlju, nego bi putem operacija na otvorenom tržištu taj pritok privremeno sterilizirale. Osim zlata, rezervne, vrlo brzo se pojavila potreba i za drugim nekim rezervnim valutama. To su u ono vrijeme bile prije svega funta, francuski franak i ta Reichsmarka. I središnje banke onda nisu držale samo zlato, nego i te valute, isto kao što i danas se drže devize značajnih središnjih banaka u rezervama. Ono što je jedinstveno i što se često zaboravlja za taj zlatni standard je da je on funkcionirao velikim dijelom zbog toga jer je Bank of England bila arbitar cijelog tog sistema. London je bio neupitni financijski centar međunarodnog financijskog sistema i Bank of England je mogao utjecati na banke koje su djelovale u Londonu putem svojih kamatnih stopa i onda bi se to automatski, zahvaljujući tim vezama između Londona i drugih ekonomija, prelijevalo i na monetarne uvjete u drugim zemljama. Dakle, vrlo slično nešto ovome što mi danas imamo kad govorimo o spillovers monetarne politike u Americi na druge zemlje. Kao što sam rekao, to je omogućilo jedan sistem u kojem zlato nije stvarno putovalo između zemalja, nego se u praksi većina tih deficita sređivalo na računima banaka u velikim financijskim centrima, Londonu, Parizu, Berlinu i New Yorku. I zanimljivo, idući put kad ćemo govoriti o međuratnom razdoblju i središnjim bankama u tom razdoblju između Prvog i Drugog svjetskog rata, opet će se te 4 središnje banke pojaviti kao ključne u tome kako su zemlje izlazile iz krize u tom razdoblju. U zaključku možemo reći da je taj zlatni standard vrlo različit od onog nekog iz čistog teoretskog zlatnog standarda. Nije bilo te rigidnosti u prilagodbama o kojima se često govori i središnje banke su često pokušavale na ovaj ili onaj način ublažiti tu rigidnost operacijama koje su provodile sa domaćim bankama i kroz kamatnu politiku. Ključno je bilo to da je Bank of England upravljala tim sistemom i puno je studija napravljeno o tome što je doprinijelo privlačnosti tog razdoblja. Od 1880. do 1914. godine je stvarno zabilježen na svjetskoj razini visok ekonomski rast. Nije bilo stvarno nikakvih restrikcija za protok kapitala i rada između ekonomija. Trgovina je bila doslovno slobodna i nije bilo većih ratova. Pitanje koje se uvijek postavlja koliko je tome, koliko se tu može zahvaliti zlatnom standardu za takvu nekakvu sigurnost i relativno dinamičan razvoj. Studije koje su rađene dosta vide u samom zlatnom standardu kao faktoru koji je promovirao te dobre svjetske ekonomske pokazatelje. Do 20% je u raznim regresijama objašnjeno samo sa postojanjem zlatnog standarda, 20% rasta u tom 35-godišnjem razdoblju. Ali kad bi se pokušali danas pitati ima li smisla vratiti se na neki rigidniji sistem međunarodnog monetarnog sustava, onda se trebamo prisjetiti ovih ključnih stvari koje danas nisu ispunjene. Više nema takve koncentracije financijske moći u jednoj zemlji, u jednom financijskom centru kao što je to bilo onda u Londonu. I više nema danas te volje među ključnim igračima u svjetskoj privredi da međusobno surađuju i da održavaju jedan takav rigidni sistem. Danas je puno prisutnija konkurencija između vodećih svjetskih privreda nego što je to bio slučaj u ono doba kada je svima odgovaralo da Bank of England na neki način bude arbitar tog sistema. U ono vrijeme već ako bi neka zemlja sama pokušala biti na zlatnom standardu, to bi ju izložilo vrlo velikoj volatilnosti i realnoj i financijskoj. Često se kaže da je u vrijeme zlatnog standarda bilo mnogo manje tih currency crisis, a mnogo više economic crisis, jer je ipak prilagodba bila potrebna ako bi zemlja imala trajne te deficite u bilanci plaćanja. Također treba imati u vidu da je povratak na takav nekakav sistem nešto rigidniji, a pogotovo onaj zasnovan na zlatu, kompliciran sa strane ponude. Taj proizvodnja zlata i ponuda zlata u svjetskoj privredi je prilično složeni proces. Ovo je recimo jedna šema koju ima World Gold Council baziran u Londonu o tome kako se od istraživanja do vađenja rude pa sve do krajnjih potrošača danas proizvodi zlato. I ono što je posebno važno je da je ta ponuda vrlo stabilna. Dakle, vidimo da još od 2010. godine tu negdje 4,5 do 5.000 tona se proizvodi godišnje. Dakle, ta neka rigidnost bi dolazila uvijek sa te strane ponude, a potražnja isto tako je prilično stabilna. Često se govori kako ona fluktuira, međutim vidite na ovom grafu to je isto između 4.000 i maksimalno nešto manje od 5.000 tona godišnje se tog zlata potroši, što najviše na nakit, nešto u tehnologiji, značajan dio za investicije i središnje banke još uvijek drže određeni dio zlata kao rezerve. Dakle, taj zlatni standard je zanimljiv sa povijesnog gledišta. To razdoblje od 70. godina do 1914. je bilo vrlo dobro za svjetsku privredu. Međutim, ako neko pita zašto se ne bi vratili na zlatni standard, mislim, jedan od odgovora može biti pa mi imamo već to inflation targeting skoro isto kao što je trajao i zlatni standard i prilično dobro funkcionira svjetska privreda i sa tim sistemom koji uopće nema nikakvu bazu u nekom metalu, nego jednostavno u sposobnosti središnjih banaka da održavaju stabilne cijene. Dakle, tu bih završio i pozivam vas onda na izlaganje za 4 tjedna kada bih govorio o središnjim bankama između 2 svjetska rata i tu bi se baš više fokusirao na središnje banke u našoj regiji, jer onda su mnoge od njih počele djelovati i onda su se počela pojavljivati vrlo zanimljiva pitanja o samostalnosti banaka, o financijskom poslovanju banaka, da li mogu imati gubitke ili ne mogu imati. I isto tako pitanja koja su relevantna danas o dominaciji velikih ekonomskih sila nad financijskim sustavom u drugim zemljama. Ako ima komentara, pitanja, vrlo rado možemo nastaviti. Ja više nemam, ne može nažalost biti tako zanimljivo kao onaj prvi dio, ali mislim da je svejedno na neki način zaokružilo tu sliku.
Skoro četvrtinu proizvodnje zlata čini kupnje centralnih banaka. I možete pojasniti zašto centralne banke kupuju zlato i zašto Hrvatska centralna banka ne kupuje zlato?
Ovo zadnje pitanje ne mogu jer ja nisam stručnjak za te stvari u Hrvatskoj. Banke kupuju uglavnom zlato u Aziji danas. Zašto kupuju zlato? To je teško objasniti nekim racionalnim ekonomskim argumentima. Puno toga je psihologija koja iz neke javnosti se onda pretače, odražava i u tome što središnje banke rade. Zlato je uvijek bio dio rezervi. Središnje banke u ovim inflation targeting zemljama u Europi i drugdje u svijetu ne vole toliko držati rezerve u zlatu, zato jer je zlato jako volatilno i onda to jako utječe na bilancu i poslovanje središnje banke. Recimo, Švicarska narodna banka još uvijek drži dosta veliki iznos, možda 1/4 u 20% u zlatu i ove godine zbog toga ima strahovito veliki profit jer je cijena zlata narasla. Ona taj profit onda mora određeni dio prenijeti kantonima i to onda stvara strahovite političke pritiske. I zbog toga je Središnja banka u Švicarskoj uvela određene propise koji dio od profita se može svake godine prenijeti na kantone. U Aziji, azijskim središnjim bankama takvi problemi ne postoje. Oni više iz nekog možda nepovjerenja trenutačnog prema dolaru žele držati veći dio rezervi u zlatu. ali nekog jasnog ekonomskog objašnjenja zašto bi morale držati središnje banke novac u zlatu nema.
Najveći skok se dogodio 2022. godine. Što je bilo 2022. godine? Invazija Rusije na Ukrajinu, što se dogodilo sa ruskim međunarodnim pričuvama. To je biti trigeriralo tu potražnju, ali kad biste vidjeli ko je iza te potražnje, onda vjerojatno zaključak bi bio ne žele biti u toj skupini zemalja. Dakle, one zemlje koje su se pobojale za svoje međunarodne rezerve su počeli kupovati zlato i skladištiti kod sebe čak. Ne samo kupovati nekako investicijsko zlato, nego fizičko zlato i skladištiti kod sebe, to nam niko ne može uzeti.
No. No. Mislim, povijesno gledano, Francuska je kupovala velike količine, ne kupovala, nego je tražila od Amerike velike količine zlata u 60-im godinama i to je djelimično isto doprinijelo padu tog Bretton Woodskog sistema, ali tu je isto neka bila neka vrsta kako bi animoziteta ili konkurentske političke konkurencije prema Americi, želja da se drži zlato, a ne američki dolar u rezervama. Ima još kakvih komentara? Ako ne, hvala vam na pažnji i nadam se da će mnogi od vas moći doći opet za jedno 4 tjedna, 17.12. predviđamo. Hvala.